And good Barry Gibb almost never sang this song again. Chapter 1. The last time they sang together. Miami, Florida. January 2003. The studio on Biscayne Boulevard sat quiet in the late afternoon heat. Through the tinted windows, palm trees swayed gently against a sky turning amber and pink, the kind of sunset that made Miami feel like a postcard. Inside, the air conditioning hummed softly, keeping the space cool, while the world outside shimmered with humidity. Barry Gibb adjusted his headphones, his fingers resting on the acoustic guitar propped against his knee. At 56, his hair had gone mostly white, but his voice, that distinctive falsetto that had defined an era, remained as strong as ever. He wore a simple black t-shirt and jeans, comfortable clothes for a session that was just between brothers. Across from him, Maurice leaned back in his chair, grinning that familiar grin, half mischief, half warmth. Mo had always been the bridge between Barry and Robin, the peacemaker, the one who could diffuse tension with a joke or a well-timed observation. His bass guitar rested against his leg, though they weren't using it for this particular arrangement. "You're overthinking it again, Bar," Maurice said, his voice carrying that easygoing rhythm that had always balanced Barry's intensity. He reached for a can of Coke sitting on the console, condensation beading on its surface. "I'm not overthinking," Barry replied, though his smile gave him away. He made a small adjustment to the tuning peg, listening intently. "I'm refining." Maurice laughed, the sound rich and familiar. "Right, refining. That's what we're calling it now?" They were working on a new arrangement of an old song, one they'd written decades ago, back when the world knew them as the Bee Gees, back when their harmonies could fill arenas and top charts across the globe. The song was called Closer Than Close. It had never been a massive hit, never reached the heights of Stayin' Alive or How Deep Is Your Love, but it meant something to them. It was about brotherhood, about being understood without words, about the connection that came from sharing not just a bloodline, but a lifetime of music. Barry strummed the opening chords, the sound clean and resonant in the acoustically treated space. Maurice hummed along, finding his harmony instinctively, the way he always did. Their voices blended, Barry's high and clear, Maurice's warm and grounding, creating that signature Bee Gees sound that was less about individual voices and more about the magic that happened when they merged. The lyrics spoke of understanding, of being known completely by another person, of a connection that transcended words. Closer than close, deeper than deep. You know my soul, the secrets I keep. No words needed, you already know. Closer than close, that's how we flow. "Remember when we first wrote this?" Maurice asked during a break, reaching for a bottle of water. The late afternoon light caught the condensation on the bottle, making it gleam. "You were mad at me about something. Can't even remember what." "You ate my sandwich," Barry said without missing a beat, his eyes twinkling. Maurice's eyes widened in mock offense. "That was one time, and it was 40 years ago. Still counts." They both laughed, the kind of laughter that only comes from shared history, from knowing someone so well that words become optional. It was the laugh of two people who'd started singing together as children in Manchester, who'd survived the brutal music industry, fame, addiction, divorces, and comebacks, who'd been through everything together. Maurice set down the water bottle and grew quieter, his expression shifting to something more contemplative. "You know what I love about this song?" Barry looked up from the guitar, meeting his brother's eyes. "It's honest," Maurice continued, his voice softer now. "No flash, no gimmicks, no disco strings or dance beats, just us. The way we are when nobody's watching." Barry nodded slowly, feeling the weight of that truth. "Yeah, just us." The afternoon stretched on. They recorded 3 takes that day, each one slightly different. The first was too polished, too careful. The second had a great feel, but Barry flubbed a chord change. The third one felt right, tight harmonies, clean guitar, nothing overdone, just two brothers singing about being brothers. When they finished, Maurice stood and clapped Barry on the shoulder, his hand warm and solid. "That's the one," he said with certainty. Barry saved the file, typed in the date, January 8th, 2003, and added some notes about the session. They packed up for the night, Maurice carefully placing his bass back in its case, Barry wrapping the guitar cable around his elbow and hand in that practiced way musicians do. Outside, the Miami evening was warm and breezy. The parking lot smelled of jasmine from a nearby hedge. Maurice paused by his car, a silver Mercedes he'd recently bought. "You want to grab dinner?" he asked. "Linda's making her famous lasagna, and you know she always makes too much." Barry shook his head. "Not tonight. I've got some mixing to do on that other project." "Rain check." "Sure thing." Maurice opened his car door, then turned back. "Same time next week?" "Same time," Barry confirmed, raising a hand in farewell. Maurice waved and pulled out of the parking lot, his taillights disappearing into the evening traffic on Biscayne Boulevard. Barry watched him go, then walked back into the studio, suddenly not ready to leave yet. He sat alone in the dimly lit control room, the only light coming from the equipment panels and the streetlights filtering through the windows. He pulled up the recording they'd just made and listened to it one more time, his eyes closed. The harmonies were perfect. That blend that only came from decades of singing together, from voices that had learned each other's every nuance and breath. Maurice's voice wrapped around his own like a warm blanket, supportive and present. Barry opened his eyes and looked at the empty chair where Maurice had been sitting just minutes before. A strange feeling passed through him. Not quite sadness, but something like appreciation. Gratitude for still having this, for still being able to create together after all these years. He made a mental note to tell Maurice that next week, to say explicitly what they often left unsaid, how much these sessions meant, how grateful he was for a brother who understood him completely. He didn't know it then, but that recording would be the last time they ever sang together, the last time Maurice's voice would harmonize with his in real time, the last time they'd share that particular magic. Barry shut down the studio, locked the door, and drove home through the Miami night, planning their next session, thinking about what they might work on, completely unaware that next week would never come. Chapter 2. The Call That Changed Everything. Miami, Florida, January 12, 2003. Barry was in his home studio when the phone rang. It was early afternoon on a Sunday, one of those lazy Florida winter days where the temperature hovered around 75 and the sky stretched endless and blue. The kind of day that made you forget there was any other season besides endless summer. He'd been working on some rough mixes for a potential solo project, tweaking levels, adjusting EQ, lost in the technical details the way he always got when he was alone with the music. His home studio was more modest than the commercial space on Biscayne, just a spare bedroom he'd converted, but it had everything he needed. The walls were covered with gold and platinum records, photographs from throughout the Bee Gees' career, and a few personal mementos that meant more to him than any award. The phone sat on the desk beside the mixing board, a cordless model that had seen better days. When it rang, he almost didn't answer. He was in the zone, and interruptions could break that fragile state of creative flow. But something made him glance at the caller ID. Yvonne, Maurice's wife. He picked up, still half focused on the waveforms on his computer screen. "Hey, Yvonne, everything okay?" There was a pause, too long, too heavy. In that silence, Barry's full attention snapped to the phone. His hand moved to the mouse, pausing the playback automatically. "Barry." Her voice was shaking, barely controlled. In the background, he could hear commotion, voices, movement, the ambient noise of crisis. "It's Mo. He's in the hospital. It's bad." Barry's hand tightened around the phone, his knuckles going white. "What happened? What do you mean it's bad?" His intestine twisted, something called volvulus. "He woke up in terrible pain this morning. We called an ambulance and they rushed him to Mount Sinai. They're doing emergency surgery right now." She paused, and he could hear her trying to steady her breathing. "Barry, you need to come. They said it's very serious." The words hit him like physical blows. Morris had been fine 4 days ago, laughing in the studio, singing, planning next week's session. How could someone go from fine to emergency surgery in 4 days? "I'm on my way," Barry said, already standing, already looking for his car keys. "I'll be there in 20 minutes, 15. "Please hurry." Oh, he didn't remember hanging up, didn't remember grabbing his wallet or his sunglasses or locking the front door. Linda was out shopping. He scrawled a quick note on the kitchen counter, "Maurice in hospital, Mount Sinai," knowing she'd see it and follow. The drive to Mount Sinai Medical Center was a blur of stoplights and honking horns that barely registered. Miami Beach on a Sunday afternoon was always busy. Tourists in rental cars, locals heading to the beach, the usual chaos of a city that never quite slowed down. But Barry's mind was elsewhere, running through a loop of denial and desperate bargaining. He was fine. He was completely fine. This is a mistake. He'll be okay. He has to be okay. Barry had lost people before. Their younger brother Andy had died in 1988 at just 30, his heart destroyed by years of drug use. Their father had passed in 1992. Death wasn't abstract to him. But Maurice, Mo, was only 53. He was healthy. He didn't smoke, barely drank anymore. He'd cleaned up his life years ago. This wasn't supposed to happen. Mount Sinai Medical Center rose up against the blue sky, a massive complex of buildings on Miami Beach. Barry pulled into the parking structure too fast, tires squealing as he took the turns. He abandoned the car in the first spot he found and ran toward the emergency entrance. Inside, the hospital smelled of disinfectant and floor polish, that particular institutional smell that seemed universal to medical facilities. The fluorescent lights were too bright after the Florida sunshine. Barry's eyes adjusted as he approached the reception desk, but before he could speak, he heard his name. "Barry!" Robin was standing near a bank of elevators, his face pale and drawn. Their older brother looked like he'd aged 10 years since Barry had seen him last month. Robin had flown in from England just yesterday for what was supposed to be a casual visit, a chance to spend time with Maurice and discuss some upcoming projects. Now he was here, in a hospital waiting room, looking devastated. Barry crossed the lobby in quick strides. "What's happening? Where is he?" "Surgery," Robin said, his voice rough. "They said it's serious. His intestine twisted, intestinal volvulus, they called it. Cut off blood supply. They're trying to fix it, but—" He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. "But what?" Robin met his eyes. "His heart. There were complications. Barry, his heart stopped on the table. They got it started again, but—" The floor seemed to tilt. Barry reached out, steadying himself against the wall. "They got it started again," he repeated. "So he's alive." "He's alive," Robin confirmed. "But they don't know. They can't tell us yet if there's damage to his brain, his heart, his other organs. The surgery is still ongoing." Yvonne emerged from a doorway, her face blotchy from crying. She came to Barry and he pulled her into a hug. This woman who'd been part of their family for years, who loved Maurice as fiercely as any of them. "I'm so sorry," she whispered into his shoulder. "I'm so sorry." "It's not your fault," Barry said, his voice thick. "It's nobody's fault." They moved to the surgical waiting room, a space designed for terrible waiting, with uncomfortable chairs and outdated magazines, and a television playing the news on mute. Other families sat in clusters, each wrapped in their own private nightmares. Barry sat down hard in one of the plastic chairs. Robin took the seat beside him. Yvonne sat across from them, twisting a tissue in her hands. "Tell me again what happened," Barry said. He needed details, needed to understand. Yvonne took a shaky breath. "He woke up around 6 this morning, complaining of stomach pain, really severe pain. At first we thought maybe it was something he ate, food poisoning or something, but it kept getting worse. He was doubled over, sweating. I called our doctor and he said to get to the emergency room immediately." "Did he say anything?" Barry asked. "Did he know it was serious?" "He was trying to make jokes," Yvonne said, and a sob broke through. "Even in the ambulance, in so much pain, he was trying to make the paramedics laugh. That's Mo. That's who he is." Barry closed his eyes. Yes, that was exactly who Morris was. The one who lightened the mood, who found humor in dark situations, who took care of everyone else even when he was the one suffering. Hours passed. The winter sunlight streaming through the waiting room windows turned golden, then amber, then faded to the purple of approaching dusk. Doctors came and went, their expressions carefully neutral, their words wrapped in medical terminology that barely masked the gravity of the situation. Still in surgery, doing everything we can. It's complicated. At some point, a nurse brought coffee. It went cold in Barry's hands, untouched. He stared at the cup, watching the surface grow still and dark, while his mind raced through memories. Maurice at 8 years old, singing harmony on their first radio performance. Maurice at 20, on stage with the Bee Gees, his bass driving their sound. Maurice at 30, struggling with alcohol, but finding his way back. Maurice at 50, happy and healthy, and talking about the future. Maurice 4 days ago, laughing about a sandwich from 40 years past. Linda arrived around 7, having seen Barry's note and driven straight over. She brought sandwiches from a deli, knowing no one would have eaten, knowing they needed to keep their strength up, even though food seemed impossible. "Any news?" she asked quietly, taking the seat beside Barry. He shook his head. Still waiting. She took his hand. Her fingers were warm, his were ice cold, despite the heated hospital air. More hours. The waiting room television cycled through the evening news, then prime-time shows, then late-night programming. Other families came and went, their dramas playing out in parallel, some left with smiles and relief, others left in tears. Barry watched them all, envying the ones who got good news, dreading the moment when a doctor would emerge for them. It was nearly midnight when the surgical doors finally opened. A doctor emerged, still in his scrubs, his surgical cap pushed back on his head. He looked exhausted. "Gibb family?" Barry stood so quickly, the chair scraped loudly against the floor. Robin rose beside him. Yvonne was already moving forward. The doctor's face said everything before his mouth opened. It was there in the set of his jaw, the sadness in his eyes, the way he couldn't quite meet their gaze directly. "I'm very sorry," he began, and the rest of the words became background noise to the roaring in Barry's ears. "We did everything we could. The volvulus was severe. We managed to repair the intestine, but his heart, the cardiac arrest, caused too much damage. Despite our best efforts, we couldn't—" The words hit like physical blows. "We couldn't save him." Yvonne collapsed. Robin caught her, his own face crumbling. Linda gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Barry just stood there, frozen, as the world tilted on its axis, and everything he'd known as stable and permanent shattered like glass. Maurice was gone, 53 years old, a lifetime of music, of laughter, of brotherhood, over in a surgical complication that nobody saw coming. Over in the space of a single day, a single twisted intestine, a single cardiac arrest. "I'm very sorry for your loss," the doctor was saying. "Is there anything we can do? Anyone we can call?" Barry didn't answer. Couldn't answer. The words were stuck somewhere in his throat, trapped behind the pressure building in his chest. Robin was crying openly now, his shoulders shaking. Yvonne was making a sound, half gasp, half sob, that sounded like her soul was being torn out. Linda was trying to hold them both, tears streaming down her own face, and Barry just stood there, staring at nothing, feeling like half of himself had been ripped away, leaving a wound that would never fully heal. Same time next week? There would be no next week, no next session, no more harmonies, no more laughter, no more brotherhood in its purest form. Maurice was gone, and Barry hadn't even had a chance to say goodbye. The hospital corridor stretched out before him, too bright, too clean, too indifferent to the fact that the world had just fundamentally changed. Somewhere in this building, his brother lay on a table, still and silent, the voice that had harmonized with his for 5 decades, finally quiet. And Barry stood in that fluorescent-lit hallway, surrounded by people who loved Morris, surrounded by grief, yet feeling utterly, completely alone. Dashum. Chapter 3. The Song He Couldn't Touch. Miami, Florida. February 2003. The funeral was held at St. Mary's Cathedral in downtown Miami, a massive Gothic revival structure that seemed too grand and too cold for someone as warm as Maurice had been. But it could accommodate the crowds, and there were crowds. Hundreds of people showed up, maybe thousands. The press was there with cameras and microphones, held back by barriers but still present, still documenting. Fellow musicians filled the pews. Members of bands they'd toured with, producers they'd worked with, artists they'd influenced, family, friends, neighbors, people Maurice had touched in ways large and small throughout his life. Barry moved through it like a ghost. He shook hands he couldn't feel, accepted hugs from people whose faces he barely registered, heard the same words over and over until they became meaningless sounds rather than actual condolences. He was so talented. Such a loss. The world is darker without him. He'll be missed. Each phrase felt hollow. Well-meaning, certainly. People were trying to help, trying to offer comfort, but hollow nonetheless. Because what could anyone say that would make this better? What words existed in any language that could fill the Morris-shaped hole that had been torn into existence? Robin gave a eulogy. Barry couldn't. When asked, he'd shaken his head, unable to imagine standing at that podium and talking about his brother in the past tense. So Robin stood there instead, his voice breaking as he talked about their childhood in Manchester, about the three brothers who dreamed of making music together and somehow, impossibly, had achieved that dream. "Maurice was our foundation," Robin said, gripping the edges of the podium. "Barry was the leader, the visionary. I was the sensitive one." Gentle laughter rippled through the cathedral. But Mo was the one who held us together, the peacemaker, the bridge, the heart of the Bee Gees. Barry sat in the front pew, Linda's hand in his, and stared at the casket. It was closed. Maurice's family had chosen that, sparing everyone the final goodbye. But Barry kept imagining his brother inside it, kept thinking about how wrong this was. How impossible. He was just here. We were just in the studio. He was just laughing. The service lasted 2 hours. Then came the procession to the cemetery, a long line of cars with headlights on in the bright Florida sunshine. They buried Maurice at Boca Raton Memorial Park, in a plot beneath a palm tree, with a view of the sky. Barry stood at the graveside as they lowered the casket, and finally the tears came. Not graceful tears, not quiet ones, but the kind that ripped out of him in gasps and sobs that he couldn't control or contain. Linda held him. Robin held him. They held each other, the last two brothers, while the earth swallowed the third. In the weeks that followed, Barry retreated into his home like a wounded animal going to ground. The house felt too big, too empty. Every room held memories. The kitchen where Maurice would raid the fridge when he visited, the living room where they'd sit and watch football, arguing good-naturedly about teams, the pool deck where Maurice had once fallen asleep in the sun and gotten such a bad burn that he'd walked funny for 3 days. Linda tried to help. She moved through the house quietly, bringing meals he barely ate, sitting with him in silence when words felt impossible, giving him space when he needed it. She understood grief, had lost her own father years before, and knew there was no rushing through it, no shortcuts around it. "You should try playing something," she suggested gently one evening about 3 weeks after the funeral. They were sitting in the living room, the television on, but neither of them watching it. "It might help." Barry shook his head. "I can't. Music has always been how you process things, how you express what you can't say." "I know, but I just can't. Not yet." "Okay." She didn't push, just sat with him. But later that night, unable to sleep, Barry found himself wandering into his home studio. The room was dark, illuminated only by the standby lights on the equipment and the moonlight filtering through the window. He stood in the doorway for a long time, just looking. His acoustic guitar hung on the wall where he always kept it, the same one he'd used in that last session with Morris, the same one they'd used for Closer Than Close. Dime meat. Before he could think better of it, Barry crossed the room and took down the guitar. The wood was cool against his hands, smooth and familiar. He sat on the stool near the window, positioning the instrument on his knee. His fingers found the strings. Muscle memory took over, his hands moving through the chord progression without conscious thought. The sound filled the quiet room, notes hanging in the air like visible things. Then Barry's voice started, automatically following the melody. Closer than close, deeper than deep. He got through the first verse, then he reached the part where Maurice's voice should have joined his, the harmony that made the song complete, that transformed it from a solo into a duet, into a conversation between brothers. The silence where that harmony should have been was deafening. It was like singing into a void, like reaching out and finding nothing there. Barry's voice wavered, cracked. His fingers fumbled the next chord. He stopped abruptly, setting the guitar down like it had burned him. The silence that followed felt worse than the incomplete song. "I can't," he said aloud to the empty room, his voice rough. "I can't do this without him." Linda appeared in the doorway, wrapped in her robe. She'd heard him playing, had come to check on him. She took in his devastated expression, the guitar he'd set aside like it was dangerous. "Then don't," she said softly, crossing to him. She put her hand on his shoulder. "Not yet, maybe not ever. It's okay. But music is what I do. It's who I am." "Then do other music. There are thousands of songs in the world, Barry. You don't have to do that one." He nodded, but they both knew it wasn't that simple, because Closer Than Close wasn't just any song. It was the last thing he and Maurice had created together. It was preserved there on a hard drive somewhere, their final collaboration, their last conversation in the language they'd spoken most fluently. And Barry couldn't touch it, couldn't listen to it, couldn't bear to hear Maurice's voice singing words about closeness and understanding when Maurice was gone, and that understanding had been severed. "Not yet" turned into days, then weeks, then months. Barry did return to music eventually, because Linda was right. Music was how he processed the world, how he made sense of chaos. He wrote new songs, dark songs at first, songs about loss and grief and the unfairness of mortality. Then gradually, as spring turned to summer, turned to fall, songs that had hints of light in them, songs about memory, about gratitude, about the love that persists even when the person is gone. He worked with Robin on some Bee Gees material, the two of them learning how to be a duo instead of a trio. It was hard, awkward at first. Their harmonies had always been three-part. Barry's falsetto, Robin's vibrato, Maurice's grounding presence. Now they had to reimagine everything with just two voices. They managed. Musicians are resilient, adaptable. They figured it out. But there were songs they didn't sing. Songs they couldn't touch, and Closer Than Close topped that list. The recording sat in Barry's archive, untouched. He'd moved it from the studio hard drive to his personal backup, labeled it carefully, dated it, but he never opened the file, never let his cursor hover over the play button. Every time he thought about it, and he thought about it often late at night when sleep wouldn't come, he heard Maurice's voice in his head, felt his presence in that studio, remembered that last session, that last laugh, that last same time next week. The song had become a monument to loss, a marker of the moment when everything changed, and Barry couldn't bear to visit it, because visiting it meant confronting the full weight of what was gone, and he wasn't strong enough for that yet. Maybe he never would be. So he avoided it, worked on other projects, kept moving forward, because standing still meant drowning in grief. And if sometimes, in the quiet moments, he heard Maurice's harmony ghost through his mind, he pushed it away and focused on something else, anything else, because Closer Than Close was too close, too raw, too real, and Barry needed to survive, which meant keeping that particular wound covered, even if it never fully healed. Chapter 4. Moving Forward, Looking Back. Los Angeles, California, November 2009. 6 years had passed since Maurice's death. 6 years that felt simultaneously like a lifetime and like yesterday. Time was strange that way, Barry had learned. It moved forward relentlessly, days accumulating into months, into years, and yet grief had its own timeline that didn't follow normal chronology. Some days, Maurice's absence felt like ancient history. Other days, Barry would turn to say something to his brother and be shocked all over again that he wasn't there. Barry had kept working because that's what you did, what musicians did when the silence became too loud. The alternative was to stop, and stopping felt like dying by another name. He and Robin had toured together, their voices carrying on the Bee Gees' legacy even though it felt incomplete, like a three-legged stool trying to balance on two. They'd performed at benefits and award shows. They'd been inducted into various halls of fame. They'd accepted honors on behalf of the group that no longer fully existed. But there were songs they didn't sing, songs they couldn't touch. Now Barry stood backstage at the Staples Center in downtown Los Angeles, listening to the crowd noise filtering through the walls. 20,000 people, maybe more, all gathered for a tribute concert, various artists celebrating the music of the Bee Gees across 5 decades. It was an honor. It was overwhelming. It was a reminder of everything they'd built and everything they'd lost. Robin approached, adjusting his collar in that nervous way he had before performances. At 59, he looked older than his years. The legacy of his own health struggles, battles with colon cancer and other ailments that had aged him prematurely. "You ready?" Robin asked. Barry turned from the curtain he'd been peering through. "As I'll ever be." Their setlist was safe. "Stayin' Alive," "How Deep Is Your Love," "Night Fever," "Massachusetts." Songs that had been performed thousands of times, songs where the muscle memory could carry you through even when your heart wasn't fully in it. Songs where the absence of that third voice, while noticeable, wasn't devastating. The stage manager appeared, headset crackling with communications from the front of house. "5 minutes, gentlemen." They made their way to the stage entrance. The opening act was finishing their set, a young pop group doing an up-tempo version of Jive Talkin' that made Barry smile despite his nerves. The crowd was loving it, their energy palpable even from backstage. "Ladies and gentlemen," the announcer's voice boomed over the PA system. "Please welcome 2/3 of one of the most successful groups in music history, Barry and Robin Gibb, the Bee Gees." The roar was deafening. Barry and Robin walked onto the stage, hit by a wall of sound and light and love that never quite stopped being startling, no matter how many times you experienced it. 20,000 people on their feet, applauding, some crying, all there to celebrate music that had soundtracked their lives. Barry picked up his guitar, Robin moved to his microphone, and they launched into "Stayin' Alive." The crowd sang along to every word, their voices filling the arena, carrying the song even in moments where Barry's voice cracked from emotion. They killed it. The energy was electric, the audience completely with them. Song flowed into song, the set list moving smoothly through decades of hits. And for those minutes on stage, Barry could almost forget the absence, could almost pretend it was like old times. Almost. But in every harmony he heard the missing piece. In every song, there was a space where Maurice should have been, on bass, on vocals, just there as he'd always been there. The audience didn't seem to notice or mind. They sang and danced and celebrated, giving Barry and Robin standing ovations between songs, showing nothing but love and appreciation. Backstage afterward, sweating and exhausted in the good way that comes after a strong performance, Barry felt the familiar post-show mix of exhilaration and melancholy. Linda was there with water and a towel, smiling. "You were wonderful," she said, kissing his cheek. "We were okay," Barry replied, being modest, being honest. Robin had already disappeared into his dressing room, probably calling his wife to tell her how it went. Barry was accepting congratulations from various crew members and backstage guests when a young woman approached tentatively. "Mr. Gibb? I'm sorry to bother you. I'm Sarah Chen." Barry shook her hand. "Nice to meet you. Great show, wasn't it?" "Incredible. Actually, I'm working on a documentary about the Bee Gees, a comprehensive retrospective for the 40th anniversary. We've been going through the archives, interviewing people, collecting footage. That sounds great. I wondered if I could ask you something. She pulled out a tablet, swiping through some files. I've been going through the recordings, and I found something from 2003, January 8th specifically. It's you and Maurice, just the two of you. The file is called Closer Than Close. I've never heard it released anywhere. Barry's expression changed immediately, the easy post-show warmth shuttering like someone had drawn a curtain. His jaw tightened. It wasn't finished. Really? Because it sounds finished to me. Sarah didn't notice, or chose to ignore, his shift in demeanor. It's beautiful, Mr. Gibb. The harmonies are incredible. I thought maybe for the documentary we could— No, Barry said, more sharply than he intended. Several people nearby glanced over. He softened his tone but kept it firm. I'm sorry. That song, it's private. Sarah's enthusiasm faltered. Oh, I didn't mean to— It's fine. I understand. You're doing your job, looking for material. But that recording isn't for public consumption. It was just us, our last session together. I don't want it out there. I completely understand, Sarah said quickly, looking genuinely apologetic. I'm sorry for bringing it up. It's just, as a documentarian, when you find something that beautiful and unknown, you want to share it. But I get it. Some things are personal. Yeah, Barry said quietly. Some things are. She thanked him for his time and melted back into the backstage crowd. But the conversation stayed with Barry, lodging in his mind like a splinter. That night, back in his hotel room high above downtown Los Angeles, Barry sat by the window looking out at the city lights. Linda was already asleep, but he was wired, his mind churning. The recording existed. It was sitting in an archive somewhere, preserved but hidden. He'd known that, obviously. He'd saved it himself 6 years ago, but hearing someone else talk about it, hearing that it was findable, made it suddenly more real. For 6 years, that song had existed in a kind of quantum state in his mind, simultaneously there and not there, real and not real. He knew it existed, but by never listening to it, never acknowledging it, he could almost pretend it didn't. But it did exist, and people knew about it. Archivists, documentarians, probably others. How long before someone decided to release it without his permission? How long before it leaked online? Barry pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts until he found his archivist's number. Neil Parker, a meticulous man who'd been managing the Bee Gees' vast catalogue of recordings for over a decade. It was late, but this was Los Angeles. Music people kept odd hours. Neil, it's Barry Gibb. I'm sorry to call so late. Barry, no worries. What can I do for you? I need you to send me something. A recording from January 2003. It should be labeled Closer Than Close. Dated January 8th. There was a pause. Of course. Do you want me to send it to your studio or— Email is fine. Just the audio file. Sure thing. I'll send it over tonight. Is everything okay? Yeah, Barry lied. Yeah, everything's fine. I need to hear it. Understood. You'll have it within the hour. Barry hung up and sat staring at his phone, wondering what he'd just done. For 6 years, he'd avoided this recording like it was radioactive. Now he was actively requesting it, pulling it out of the archive and into his present. The email arrived 43 minutes later, a simple message from Neil with an attached MP3 file. Subject line, January 8th, 2003. Closer Than Close. Gibb, Gibb. Barry stared at the email for a long time. His finger hovered over the attachment, trembling slightly. Then he closed his phone and set it face down on the nightstand. Not yet. He'd taken the first step, requesting the file, acknowledging its existence. But listening to it was a different matter entirely. That could wait. The phone sat there in the dark hotel room, containing a piece of the past, a conversation with a ghost, and Barry lay awake until dawn, knowing it was there but unable to press play, caught between the desperate desire to hear his brother's voice and the paralyzing fear of what that would cost him emotionally. Some wounds, he was learning, never fully healed. You just learned to live around them, to function despite them, to build a life that accommodated the permanent ache. But maybe, just maybe, learning to live with them meant eventually being able to look at them directly, to touch them without flinching. Maybe, but not tonight. Chapter 5. Listening Again. Miami, Florida, March 2010. The file sat on Barry's computer for 4 months before he could bring himself to open it. 4 months of it being there, present and accessible, while he worked around it, creating and producing other music, living his life, pretending he wasn't avoiding it. But he was. Every time he opened his computer, there it was in his recent downloads. Closer Than Close, January 8th, 2003, MP3. Every time he saw it, his stomach clenched and he quickly clicked on something else. Linda noticed, of course. She always noticed. "You going to listen to it?" she asked one evening in late February as he sat at his home studio desk, staring at his screen. "Eventually," he said. "What are you waiting for?" "I don't know. The right moment, I guess." "Barry," she said gently, "there's never going to be a right moment. Grief doesn't work that way. You just have to decide to do it." She was right, as usual, but knowing something intellectually and being emotionally ready for it were two different things. The catalyst came unexpectedly, as these things often do. Robin called in early March with news. He was going into the hospital for tests. Nothing serious, he assured Barry, just precautionary. Some abdominal pain that wouldn't go away, probably nothing, but the doctors wanted to be thorough. Barry had heard probably nothing before. He'd heard just precautionary before. He'd heard all the medical euphemisms that preceded bad news. After he hung up, he sat in his studio, suddenly aware of how fragile everything was, how quickly people could be taken, how little time might be left with the only brother he had remaining. He looked at the file name on his computer. Closer Than Close. The last recording with Maurice, a conversation preserved in time, waiting for him to press play and listen. If he waited much longer, would he lose the context? Would the emotional memory fade until it was just sounds on a recording rather than a moment lived? Or worse, what if something happened to Robin and Barry found himself entirely alone, the last Gibb brother, with nothing but recordings of voices that no longer existed in the world? Before he could second-guess himself, before fear could stop him, Barry double-clicked the file. The audio player opened. The waveform appeared on screen. Peaks and valleys representing sound, representing that afternoon in January 2003. The cursor sat at the beginning, ready to play. Barry's finger hovered over the spacebar. Just press it. It's just a recording. It's just Maurice's voice. You've heard his voice 1,000,000 times, but this was different. This was the last time, the last new thing he'd ever hear Maurice say or sing. Once he listened to this, there would be nothing left that was unheard, nothing held in reserve. "Just press it," he muttered to himself. "Stop being a coward and press it." He pressed it. The guitar came in first, his own playing, clean and bright. The sound was remarkably clear. Neil had done good work on the archival transfer. Then, Barry's own voice, singing the opening verse. Closer than close, deeper than deep. And then, right on cue, Maurice's harmony joined in. The effect was immediate and devastating. Barry's breath caught in his chest, his eyes instantly filling with tears. That voice, warm, familiar, beloved, filled the room as clearly as if Maurice was standing there. "You know my soul, the secrets I keep." The blend was perfect. That Gibb brothers sound that had taken decades to develop, that came from shared genetics and shared lives and countless hours of singing together. Barry's high falsetto and Maurice's lower harmony wrapping around each other like strands of DNA. Barry closed his eyes and just listened. In the recording you could hear everything, not just the voices and the guitar, but the small sounds that made it human. The breath Maurice took before each phrase, the tiny adjustment Barry made to his finger position on the fretboard, the creak of a chair as someone shifted weight, and you could hear the love. It was there in the way they listened to each other, in the tiny adjustments they made to stay perfectly in tune. in the easy comfort of two people who knew each other completely. No words needed. You already know, closer than close. That's how we flow. When the song ended, just 2 minutes and 47 seconds he saw on the player, Barry sat in silence. Tears streamed down his face, but they weren't entirely sad tears. Mixed in with the grief was something else. Gratitude, love, a kind of bittersweet joy that this existed, that this moment had been captured, that he could hear his brother's voice again, not through memory, which could fade and distort, but exactly as it had been. He played it again and again. Each time it hurt a little less. Each time he could appreciate more. The musicality of it, the beauty of the harmonies, the simple perfection of two brothers making something together. On the fourth listen, he picked up his acoustic guitar, the same one from the recording, still hanging on the wall, and played along. His fingers found the chords automatically, muscle memory kicking in. He didn't sing, just played, letting Maurice's recorded voice fill the space. It felt like a conversation across time, like Maurice was in the room with him, not as a ghost or a memory, but as a collaborator, a brother, a friend. When it ended, Barry set down the guitar and just sat there, feeling something shift inside him. The song was still painful. It probably always would be, but it wasn't unbearable anymore. It wasn't a wound he had to avoid touching. It was a gift, a time capsule, a preserved moment of connection that he could return to whenever he needed to feel close to his brother again. Barry opened his email and wrote to Robin, "Just listen to the last recording Mo and I made. You should hear it. Not sure I'm ready to share it with the world yet, but I wanted you to know it exists. It's beautiful. He was beautiful. We were lucky to have him, as long as we did." He hit send, then sat back in his chair, exhausted but somehow lighter. The file was no longer something to be feared. It was something to be treasured, and maybe, someday, something to be shared. But for now, it was enough to know it was there. To know he could press play whenever the absence became too heavy. To know that in this one way, Maurice wasn't entirely gone. His voice lived on. Their brotherhood lived on. And that was something. Chapter 6. The First Time Back. London, England, September 2014. The Royal Albert Hall was an iconic venue, a Victorian masterpiece of red brick and terracotta that had hosted everyone, from the Beatles to Adele. Standing backstage, looking out at the ornate interior with its circular tiers rising toward the massive glass dome, Barry felt the weight of history pressing down. This was a special concert, a celebration of the Bee Gees' 50th anniversary in music. Half a century of making music, of harmonies, of brotherhood. Except now there was only one brother left. Robin had died 2 years earlier in May 2012. Like Maurice, the loss had been sudden. Complications from cancer and a twisted intestine that eerily paralleled Maurice's final days. Barry had been there at the end, had held his hand, had watched as yet another brother slipped away. Now Barry was the last Gibb brother standing, the sole survivor of a trio that had once seemed invincible, immortal in the way young people feel immortal. He was 68 years old. His hair was white, his face lined with decades of life and loss. But his voice, that distinctive falsetto, remained strong, a gift and a burden. The concert tonight was sold out. 5,000 people filling every seat, all there to celebrate music that had defined generations. The evening would feature various artists performing Bee Gees songs, a musical theatre star doing To Love Somebody, a young pop singer tackling Stayin' Alive, an R&B group harmonizing on How Deep Is Your Love, and Barry himself would perform, of course. The last living link to the music, the last one who could say, "I was there when we wrote that, and I remember the day we recorded it." His musical director, John Merchant, approached with the finalized set list printed on a single sheet of paper. John had worked with Barry for years, understood his artistic vision, knew when to push and when to let Barry lead. "We're still good with the lineup?" John asked, handing over the paper. Barry scanned it. The usual hits were there. Massachusetts. Words. Stayin' Alive. How Deep Is Your Love? Songs he could perform in his sleep. Songs that had been part of his life for so long, they felt less like compositions and more like breathing. But at the bottom, in his own handwriting added just that morning, was one more song, Closer Than Close. He stared at it, his stomach tightening. "We're good," Barry said quietly. John followed his gaze to the bottom of the list. "You sure about this one? We've never performed it live. Hell, I've never even heard it except on that recording you sent me." "I'm sure. It's going to be emotional." "I know." John studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Okay, we'll need to set up for it. Just you and the acoustic?" "Just me and the acoustic, and—" Barry paused. "And Maurice." "The recording?" "Yeah. I want to play the harmony track through the PA, so it'll be like we're singing together one more time." John's expression softened. "That's going to destroy people, you know, in a good way, but still." "I know. You sure you can handle it?" Barry wasn't sure. He'd listened to the recording dozens of times now over the past 4 years. It no longer devastated him the way it once had. But listening alone in his studio was one thing. Performing it in front of 5,000 people was another matter entirely. But he felt ready, or as ready as he'd ever be. "I can handle it," he said with more confidence than he felt. The concert began at 8 p.m. sharp. The opening number was a medley performed by a full orchestra. Snippets of Bee Gees' hits woven together into a 10-minute suite that had the audience on their feet before a single word was sung. Then came the guest performers, each bringing their own interpretation to songs Barry had written decades ago. It was strange hearing his work filtered through other voices, other styles. Sometimes he liked what they did with it. Sometimes it felt wrong, like they'd missed the point. But he applauded each one graciously, appreciating the respect and love behind every performance. When his turn came, about 2/3 through the show, the audience erupted. Barry walked onto the stage, guitar in hand, and the ovation lasted for what felt like hours, but was probably just 2 or 3 minutes. He performed the hits, the songs everyone knew, everyone loved. The crowd sang along to every word, their voices filling the Royal Albert Hall with melodies he'd written in studios and hotel rooms and tour buses scattered across 5 decades. Between songs, he told stories about writing Massachusetts Homesick in a New York hotel, about the disco era and how Stayin' Alive almost didn't get released, about his brothers, about the magic that happened when 3 voices became one. The audience hung on every word, laughing at the funny parts, sighing at the touching ones. Then, as they approached the end of his set, Barry paused. The chatter in the audience quieted. Something in his demeanor had changed, become more serious, more vulnerable. "I want to do something I haven't done before," he said, his voice soft but carrying in the excellent acoustics of the hall. "This next song, I wrote it with my brother Maurice. We recorded it together in January 2003, just the 2 of us, not long before he passed. The silence in the hall was complete. You could have heard a pin drop. I haven't performed it since," Barry continued. "Couldn't bring myself to. It was too close, too personal. But I think it's time." He paused, gathering himself. "Music is how we talk to each other, my brothers and me. It's how we say things we can't say any other way. And this song is about that. About being understood without words. About the connection that comes from truly knowing someone." He sat on a stool that had been set up center stage, positioning his acoustic guitar on his knee. The lights dimmed until there was just a single spotlight illuminating him. "Mo, this is for you," he said softly. Then he took a breath and began to play. The opening chords rang out, filling the vast space of the Royal Albert Hall, clear and pure and achingly beautiful. Barry's fingers moved over the strings with practiced precision, muscle memory guiding them. He started to sing, closer than close, deeper than deep. His voice was strong, clear, carrying the melody just as it had 11 years ago in that Miami studio. But when he reached the first harmony, the part where Maurice's voice should have joined his, he let it ring out alone for just a moment. Then, from the speakers positioned around the hall, Maurice's recorded voice joined in. The effect was stunning. Gasps rippled through the audience. People who'd been holding it together suddenly weren't. The two brothers, separated by death but united by music, singing together one more time. Barry's live voice and Maurice's recorded harmony blended perfectly, creating that signature Bee Gees sound that had captivated the world. The acoustics of the Royal Albert Hall were perfect for it, carrying both voices equally, making it impossible to tell which was present and which was memory. You know my soul, the secrets I keep. Barry sang through the entire song, tears streaming down his face, but his voice never wavering. The guitar work was perfect, the harmonies were perfect. Everything was exactly as it should be. In the audience, people were crying openly, not from sadness exactly, but from the beauty of it, from the love that was audible in every note. From witnessing something precious and rare, a moment of pure connection across the boundary of mortality. No words needed, you already know. Closer than close, that's how we flow. When Barry reached the final chord, he let it sustain, ring out, fade slowly into silence. The guitar's resonance hung in the air for several seconds after his fingers left the strings. Then, silence. Complete, absolute silence. Then the applause started. Slowly at first, then building into a crescendo that shook the rafters of the Royal Albert Hall. The entire audience on its feet, some applauding, some still too overwhelmed to do anything but cry. Barry sat on his stool, spent, his guitar still in his hands. The applause continued, minutes of it, waves of love and appreciation and recognition of what they'd just witnessed. Backstage afterward, Barry sat in his dressing room, still processing what had just happened. John Merchant came in, shaking his head in wonder. "That was something special," John said. "Really special." Barry nodded, unable to speak yet. "How do you feel?" Barry thought about it, explored the emotions swirling in his chest. Grief, yes, always grief, but also something lighter. "Lighter," he said finally, "like I've been carrying something heavy, and I finally put it down." "What do you mean?" "That song. For 11 years, it's been this thing I couldn't touch. This reminder of loss, of absence. But tonight, performing it, it became something else. It became a celebration. A way to be with Maurice again, not through grief, but through music." John smiled. "That's beautiful." "Yeah." Barry stood, setting his guitar in its stand. "Yeah, it is." As he left the venue that night, signing autographs and accepting tearful thanks from fans, Barry felt a fundamental shift inside himself. The song was no longer a burden. It was no longer too painful to touch. It was a bridge, a way to stay connected to his brother, not through avoiding the pain, but by moving through it, transforming it into something that honored Maurice's memory rather than being destroyed by his absence. He'd sung with his brother again, and it had been beautiful. Dödsika, Chapter 7. The Song Lives On. Miami, Florida, January 2024. 21 years had passed since Maurice's death. 2 decades of living with the absence, of finding ways to honor the memory, of transforming grief into something that could coexist with joy. Barry sat in his home studio, now 77 years old, but still making music, still creating, still finding new ways to express himself through sound. The studio had been updated over the years, new equipment, digital interfaces, software that would have seemed like magic back in 2003, but some things remained constant. The acoustic guitar hanging on the wall was the same one. The same instrument he'd played in that last session with Maurice, the same one he'd played at the Royal Albert Hall 10 years ago, the same one he'd played thousands of times in between. A journalist from Rolling Stone sat across from him, a young woman named Jessica Martinez, who'd been assigned to write a retrospective piece on the Bee Gees for their website. Her recorder sat on the desk between them, its red light indicating they were live. "You've said that Closer Than Close was the hardest song you ever had to return to," Jessica said, glancing at her notes. What made you finally do it? What changed? Barry leaned back in his chair, considering the question. Outside the window, Miami sunshine painted the palm trees gold, the same view he'd had for decades, constant and familiar. I think I had to reach a place where I could honor the memory without being consumed by the loss, he said slowly, choosing his words carefully. That song represented everything Maurice and I were together. Brothers, musicians, friends. For a long time, touching it felt like tearing open a wound that wouldn't heal, like I was choosing to hurt myself every time I thought about it. And now it feels like a gift. I get to sing with my brother again every time I perform it. Not many people get that chance. Most people lose someone and that's it. They're gone, and you only have memories. But I have Maurice's voice, preserved exactly as it was, and I can blend my voice with his whenever I want. That's precious. Jessica nodded, her expression thoughtful. The song has developed quite a following since you started performing it. There are YouTube videos of your performances that have millions of views. People connect with that story, losing someone but finding them again through music. Barry smiled slightly. Music does that. It preserves moments, emotions, connections. That recording from 2003 is a time capsule. When I listen to it, Maurice isn't gone. He's right there in the room with me. His voice is exactly as it was, not distorted by memory, not faded with time. Just him, singing those words we wrote together. Do you perform it often now? Not every show. It's still emotional, still takes something out of me, but when it feels right, when the moment calls for it, yes. I did it last month in Las Vegas, actually. Big theater, couple thousand people. And it still gets me, you know? Still makes me cry. But it's not a sad crying anymore, not entirely. It's more like grateful crying, if that makes sense. It makes perfect sense, Jessica said. When you perform it, you use the original recording for the harmony parts, right? Yeah. I tried once to have another singer do Maurice's part. Thought maybe it would be less emotional if it wasn't actually his voice, but it felt wrong. Felt like I was replacing him rather than honoring him. So I went back to using the original recording. It's the only way it works. Jessica made some notes, then looked up. Can you talk about what it's like emotionally when you're performing it? What goes through your mind? Barry was quiet for a moment, remembering. It's strange, complex. When I first start playing, there's always a moment of anxiety. Can I do this? Am I going to fall apart? But then the guitar comes in and my hands know what to do. Muscle memory takes over. And when I start singing, I'm not thinking about being on stage or about the audience. I'm back in that studio in 2003. He paused, his eyes distant. And then Maurice's voice comes in, he continued, and it's like time collapses. I'm 68, 70, 77, whatever age I am when I'm performing, but I'm also 56 again in that moment, and Maurice is there with me, and we're just two brothers making music together. Everything else falls away. The grief, the years, the loss. For those 2 minutes and 47 seconds, we're together again. Jessica's own eyes were wet. That's beautiful. Yeah, it is. But you know what's really amazing? How it affects other people. After shows, people come up to me in tears, telling me about their own losses, siblings, parents, friends, spouses, and they thank me for showing them that there's a way to stay connected, that love doesn't die just because the person does. That's not something I set out to do. I was just trying to find a way to live with my own grief. But if it helps other people, he shrugged, that makes the vulnerability worth it. Jessica asked a few more questions about specific performances, about whether he'd ever release an official studio version of the song, about what he thought Maurice would think of how the song had been received. Barry answered thoughtfully, noting that he'd resisted releasing a studio version. The live performances, he felt, captured something more authentic, more emotionally true. As for Maurice's reaction, Barry smiled. Mo would probably make some joke about how I was milking it, he said with a laugh. He had this way of puncturing pretension, of keeping things light even when they were heavy. but I think he'd be happy. I think he'd like knowing that something we created together still matters, still moves people, still keeps us connected. The interview wrapped up around noon. Jessica thanked him profusely, promised to send him a link when the article published, and gathered her equipment. After she left, Barry sat alone in the studio for a while, as he often did after talking about Maurice. The memories stirred up by interviews like this could be overwhelming if you let them, but he'd learned over the years how to sit with them, how to let them pass through rather than trying to push them away. He pulled up the original recording on his computer, that same file he'd avoided for so long, then listened to repeatedly, and eventually shared with the world. The file was labeled Closer Than Close, January 8, 2003, Original, Do Not Delete. He'd made that label after accidentally almost deleting it during a hard drive cleanup 5 years ago. The panic he'd felt in that moment had made him realize how precious this file was, how irreplaceable. Barry pressed play and closed his eyes. The guitar came in, his voice. Then Maurice's harmony. Closer than close, deeper than deep. He listened all the way through, as he did periodically, just to remind himself that this existed, that this moment had been real, that Maurice's voice was preserved exactly as it had been on that January afternoon. When it ended, Barry opened his eyes and looked at the waveform on the screen. He'd probably looked at this exact image hundreds of times over the past 20 years, could probably draw it from memory. "Hey, Mo," he said softly to the empty room, as he sometimes did when he was alone. "Thanks for this one. Thanks for everything." He saved the file, an unnecessary action since it hadn't been modified, but a ritual he observed every time he listened, and shut down the computer. Outside, the afternoon was gorgeous. Linda had gone to visit their daughter, and the house was quiet in that peaceful way empty houses can be. Barry picked up the acoustic guitar from the wall, carried it to the back porch, and sat in his favorite chair overlooking the pool. The water sparkled in the sunlight. Palm fronds rustled in the breeze, and somewhere a mockingbird was running through its repertoire of stolen songs. His fingers found the opening chords to Closer Than Close, without conscious thought. After 21 years, his hands knew this song as well as they knew anything. He played it all the way through, singing along quietly, just for himself. Not performing, not recording, just playing, just being with the music and the memory of the brother who'd helped create it. When he finished, he set the guitar aside and just sat there, watching the light play on the water, thinking about time and loss and love and music. People sometimes asked him if it got easier. The grief, the absence, the missing, and the truth was complicated. In some ways, yes. The sharp edges had worn smooth with time. The acute pain had faded to a chronic ache that he'd learned to live around. But in other ways, no. You never stopped missing someone you loved. You never fully accepted that they were gone. You just learned to carry the absence differently, to integrate it into your life in a way that didn't destroy you. Music had been his way of doing that. Closer Than Close had started as something too painful to touch, a monument to loss that he couldn't bear to approach. But over time, through the slow process of healing, it had transformed into something else. A bridge, a connection, a way to be with his brother again, not through avoiding the pain, but by moving through it, transforming it into something that honored Maurice's memory, rather than being destroyed by his absence. And that felt like wisdom. Like something earned through suffering, but ultimately worthwhile. Barry stood, picking up the guitar, and walked back into the house. He hung the instrument carefully on the wall, in its designated spot, where it would wait until the next time he needed it. Then he pulled out his phone and sent a text to his children and grandchildren, thinking about Uncle Maurice today. What a gift it was to have him in our lives. What a gift music is, preserving the people we love. Responses came quickly, hearts and memories and photos of Maurice making funny faces, Maurice at family gatherings, Maurice being Maurice. Barry smiled, feeling the familiar mix of sadness and gratitude that came with these reminiscences. The song might have started as his way of coping with loss, but it had become something larger, A reminder that love persisted beyond death. That connection could transcend absence. That music, at its best, could hold both the joy and the sorrow of being human. And in that truth, Barry had found not closure, because grief didn't work that way, but peace. The understanding that grief and love weren't opposites, but companions. That honoring someone's memory sometimes meant being willing to feel the full weight of their absence. That music could heal, even when it hurt, especially when it hurt. The Miami sun moved across the sky, painting the afternoon in shades of gold and amber. Inside his studio, on a hard drive, a recording waited. Two brothers singing together, their voices blending in perfect harmony, preserved forever in that moment of creation. And Barry Gibb, the last of the brothers, carried on, making music, sharing memories, honoring the past while continuing to live in the present. Because that's what Maurice would have wanted. That's what the song was about after all. Being closer than close, deeper than deep, connected in ways that death couldn't sever. That's how they flowed, and that's how they always would. The end.